Two important life events brought me to my ongoing interest in studying toxins. The first was moving to Logan, Utah in 2000. As a housewarming gift, and I use this term quite ironically, a friend gave me a copy of Chipboard's Canaries on the Rim, Living Downwind in the West. In it, it details the toxic waste disposal companies, the chemical weapons incineration plants, the nuclear waste facilities, and the industrial pollution found in the West Desert of Utah. Later, I would come to learn about the state's nuclear legacy, the toxic mine tailings, and toxic air. Welcome to Utah. The second was living in Vietnam in 2004 and 2005. I was there with my husband and our 2-year-old son. The same year, the Vietnamese government was suing U.S. chemical companies for the compensation for harm done to the Vietnamese people during the war. The U.S. sprayed 11 million gallons of dioxin-laden defoliant agent orange on the jungles and croplands of Vietnam. At the time, dioxin's harmful effects on human health were already well documented. American veterans had already won reparations for their Agent Orange illnesses from chemical companies already in 1984. While the soldiers and the Vietnamese citizens' lawsuits were similar to the one, one of the differences actually would change the course of my research. The Vietnamese government was attempting to prove that Agent Orange was teratogenic, that it manifested in diseases and deformities in the children and grandchildren of those who had been sprayed years or even decades earlier. In Vietnam, the argument for injury was fought as much in public spaces as legal and scientific arenas. As you can see here, the Vietnamese news reports covering the trial were replete with images of Vietnamese children and grandchildren who were suffering. There were also, of course, pictures of American planes dropping Agent Orange in Vietnam. I collected these images in the beginning of what has now been a 20-year investigation into the role of the visual in constructing and understanding toxicity. This research is actually somewhat of a paradox. In his work on toxic portraits, Barnett explains a number of compounding problems of visibility posed by contaminants. And as all of you who do this work know, toxins can be physically invisible. One cannot see VOCs, radon, radiation, or carbon monoxide. Also, toxic sites oftentimes don't look dangerous. In fact, some of the most polluted locations appear to be vibrant nature reserves. This is part of Rocky Flats Wildlife Refuge. Rocky Flats was a military complex in Colorado that produced parts for nuclear weapons. Plutonium contamination was hundreds of times higher than the levels found at nuclear test sites. After $7 billion, that's with a B, dollars of cleanup, people are still only allowed on the land that was the security buffer. The area where the facility was actually located is still too dangerous. But yet, looking at the landscape, it appears to be a nature preserve. Another invisibility is toxic induced illnesses can take years to manifest, making toxins' effects on the body invisible and extraordinarily difficult to prove, even if suspected. Barnett notes that the pain and suffering associated with toxins evade both verbal and visual representation. I would add to that even those people who recognize this causal relationship between toxin and disease are able to explain their pain and suffering with great eloquence and can provide visual documentation of their illness, can still be made to feel invisible when there is no audience that is willing to accept their explanations for their suffering. In addition, toxins are frequently hidden. Landfills are located outside of town and waste is shipped to other poorer countries. Dangerous products can appear innocuous, and we place them on the high shelves in our garages and in our closed cabinets beneath the sink. One must be trained to see toxins in products, and those with certain levels of privilege are required to actively seek out visibly polluted places, as Phaedra Pizzullo discusses in her work on toxic tours. Which leads us to Barnett's final category, invisibility. Toxins are disproportionately allocated to political invisible communities, such as those inhabited predominantly by poor people and people of color. And I know, as all of you know, the toxic load is not distributed equally Jennifer Sass, a senior scientist with the Natural Resource Defense Council, has said, quote, "The siting of polluting industry facilities is both racist and classist, but mostly racist." So the question you rightly should be asking is, why study images and toxins? While toxins are physically and socially hidden, at the same time, toxins are also visually constructed through symbols and diagrams and videos and photographs. This is especially important now. We have a highly visual world, Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, whatever the kids are using these days. And not having something to show can frequently mean not having something to say. Also, visuals work differently than words. Audience process visuals faster and more efficiently than written text, and visuals contain more information than any other subject form. Images aid in information recall, particularly when visuals contain dramatic, new, and negative information. Visual messages override other messages when processed simultaneously. People believe what they see more than what they hear or read. And when visual messages are in conflict, viewers have difficulty remembering the verbal information. They have a powerful influence on attitude and beliefs, and images quickly and memorably communicate impressions to viewers in ways the audiences believe that they understand, and they oftentimes do not. Finally, when we're talking about toxins, of course, invisible things can cause harm and injury. But if people can't see them, they're less likely to be aware or act accordingly to those things they cannot see or recognize. That said, once being aware of invisible dangers, the threat can take an outsized role in risk calculations, as those things that lurk unseen, like radiation, can seem much more frightening than the everyday dangers, such as driving a car. Anthony Giddens writes, "We live in a new risk environment for which history provides us with very little previous experience. We often don't really know what the risks are, let alone how to calculate them accurately in terms of probability. So, what do we do when we cannot accurately calculate the risks of living in our environments?" And I would argue that we create toxic imaginaries. I define the toxic imaginary as the collective stories and images and symbols and rituals that individuals and societies use to navigate the uncertainty of living in a toxic environment. They are imaginary, not fantasy, but the means of conceptualizing an individual's place within a collective, the entirety of which a person can never witness. Imaginaries establish certain beliefs and norms and make sense of our practices. They give us direction in terms of purpose and timing and appropriateness. The toxic imaginary is necessary because we cannot trace every ingredient in our food or the chemical composition of the things we touch. We cannot learn the life cycle of every product we use to see if it might cause harm. But we do some of these things sometimes, but certainly not all the time. People still need to make decisions. They need to decide on a course of action in daily life to try to attempt to keep healthy. To do so, societies create these toxic imaginaries that work as a shorthand for individuals to help them decide what to eat or drink, or when to wash their hands, or what products and activities to avoid and use, and most importantly, when they should feel that they are at risk. They are created through fictive and non-fictive narratives, discursive and non-linguistic symbols, rituals, and other acts. The word imaginary is also used to remind us that individuals are always making these decisions with limited, partial, biased, changing, and imperfect information. So I had this idea. The toxic imaginary, of course, has evolved as I've done my work. For my research, my absolutely unattainable goal has been to write about every different way the Western public audiences might encounter representations and images of toxicity. So far, this has led me to write about visual narratives in news and popular media, toxic symbols and how they function, toxic sublime images, toxic grotesque landscapes, toxic shock photographs of adverse human health outcomes, how toxic events are visually constructed in the media, and how toxins are depicted in comics. And the short answer to how toxins are depicted in comics is they are everywhere. Radiation alone creates some of the most iconic heroes and villains. Toxins are weapons, but they also have transformative potential to metamorphosize the normal into the extraordinary. So for today, I've picked topics that I think are most interesting and useful to clear with your work on volatile organic compounds in urban areas and the migration of toxins into people's homes. You can invite me back and I'll talk about comics. Today, I'm going to talk first about toxic symbols. This isn't where I started my research on the toxic imaginary. I actually began looking at landscape photographs. But at the time I was working on these images and I tried to explain my work to my family and friends, I'd say, I'm examining the ways we see toxins. And they said, oh, you mean Mr. Yuck? And I'd say, no. And they'd say radiation signs. And I'd say, nope. And then they'd say, oh, those warnings you see on the back of spray adhesives and the side of semi-trucks. And I'd say, well, still not. So it was clear that toxic symbols were something I would need to explore. So for this particular project, I examined how hazard symbols that are stripped of their scientific, technological, and political complexities reflect and produce cultural beliefs and understandings of toxins. I charted the symbols in terms of the level of abstraction, higher abstraction at the top, lower abstraction at the bottom, and then the level of information. Do they provide no information, little information? And I wanted to see the different ways these symbols functioned within the Western toxic imaginary. I found the symbols as a whole to simplify complex science and health information. They provide, enhance, or cue existing knowledge. They provide warning or elicit caution, and they suggest behavior. They also do a whole lot of other things that the people who created them might never have considered. They, of course, dictate what is and is not considered toxic. You see at the top, something that's not toxic, it's good, but at the bottom, it's incredibly hazardous. I think less often it is, I think it's less obvious that it's also done through placement. So placing a hazard symbol in one location can give the false impression that the toxins are not in another. For example, having a hazard sign on a container of herbicide, but not in the yard in which the defoliant has been sprayed, or having a hazard sign on the herbicide, but not in the bottle of air freshener that is purchased at the same time. Because the symbol isn't present, the product is assumed to be safe. Toxic symbols depend on affect or feeling, and it's created through the design elements of color and line and shape to construct meaning. Square shapes and equally spaced lines, as we see here with the air quality index. It can provide subtle reassurances that the toxins are controllable and contained even when they're not. Toxic symbols also hide inequity. This is the radiation trefoil. It was created in 1946 by the University of California, Berkeley Radiation Laboratory. The designers conceived of it as being used by academics and professionals who already had knowledge of radiation. They thought it would be a specialized symbol for people who had specialized knowledge. The Berkeley designers could have no idea how long the symbol would last or how far it spread. The radiation sign has been placed in labs, but also on hospital machinery that has been shipped to non-Western, non-English speaking countries for disposal. This lack of an inherent meaning that they thought would be very important has become a tragedy when workers and scrap metal salvagers do not see the danger in this simple sign. When asked, they often describe it as a propeller. They have little means of knowing the illness and for some death that can come from their lack of specialized knowledge. Reading through these reports, I was struck by how often the victims were explicitly or implicitly blamed for their contamination because they hadn't heeded the warning. After its use for 70 years, in 2007, a new radiation symbol was launched by the International Organization for Standardization and the International Atomic Energy Agency, and it was an attempt to address some of the concerns that I just laid out. I have to say, as someone who studies symbols, I still question their claim of universal understanding. Red does not mean the same in places. We still see the propeller. Skull and crossbones, yes, more so, but it also can mean things like the Day of the Dead. But is certainly certainly better than what was before, because it also tells you there's something that's out there, it is harmful, and it gives you a sense of what you should do, which of course is to run. Toxic symbols also construct individual agency. You, as the individual, are supposed to keep out, while ignoring industrial and political responsibilities. And they assume information creates good individual decision-making that can result in individuals, as I said, being blamed for their own harm. In addition, repetition of certain images and certain compositional events within an image can also reinforce particular understandings of environmental toxins that are beyond the intended information about the contaminant. For this research project, I was also interested in infographics that describe toxins in the home, maybe similar to some of the work that you all are doing. And as I flip through some of these, see if you can note some similarities. We're just looking at the visuals. As you can clearly see, almost every image was drawn with a detached house in a suburban, if not rural area, a yard, a house with multiple stories, a car, and a garage. These images are clearly created for an American audience, but in the US, 40% of people do not live in detached single-family dwellings. And I would expect that that number would actually be higher around the globe. When we have this repetition of a particular identity, a particular space, a particular place in toxic symbols, it creates norms and understandings of toxicity. This can work against those who do not see themselves in these descriptions on how to be protected. In their simplicity of message, they also, of course, have simplicity of message, which is not a bad thing, but they can mask the extent and complexity of the problem and limit the ability of the individual to adequately protect themselves or to create an impact on the toxic whole in which they live. Symbols are only one way in which people are shown toxins. Photographs are also used to show pollutants' impacts on humans and the environment. And this is some of the work that I did on the toxic sublime. This magazine was sitting on our counter for months. My husband is an English professor and he's a writer. It was short stories talking about climate, but I was just fascinated by the cover. What is causing the color of that river? What is the black landscape? The contrast arrested me. What caused it? Is it real? Did they use a filter? And then I finally tracked down the photograph. It's an image of nickel tailings taken by noted landscape photographer Edward Brudzinski. And then I looked up hundreds of Brudzinski's other images, and ones taken by other contemporary landscape photographers, such as David Maisel. As I was looking through all of these, I was dismayed, but not necessarily surprised at how often the images were actually taken in Utah. At the time I was finding these photographs and looking through these photographs, I was also teaching environmental communication. And in my class, we were discussing the use of sublime descriptions and images that were used to convince Eastern politicians in the 1860s to protect Western landscapes that they'd never seen, such as places like Yosemite Valley. And for me, the article raised the question to the relationship between toxicity that I'm seeing in all of these images and this very powerful concept of the sublime. Edmund Burke discusses the power of the sublime by comparing it to the beautiful. He says, he wrote, in beauty, things are small objects that are smooth and delicate, elegant, graceful, clean, fair, and mild in color. But with the sublime, it's the vastness, the privation, difficulty, infinity, magnitude, but also magnificence. I would add awe and fear. The sublime originally had religious connotations. It was the feeling that one was supposed to feel if they stared in the face of God. That feeling was then transferred to talk about the feeling of awe and fear and the magnitude of nature, either standing at the bottom of the cliff and looking up or looking down over the edge. Nye discusses the technological sublime people feel when they're staring up at a skyscraper or seeing a rocket launch into space. I used it to talk about the contradictory feelings one has when seeing the magnitude of human impact on the environment. And so I used the toxic sublime. I came up with this concept. It's the tensions that arise from recognizing the toxicity of a place, an object, or a situation while simultaneously appreciating its mystery, its magnificence, and its ability to inspire awe. The work introduced 5 tensions that I found within the toxic sublime as a means of understanding how images work to create certain reactions in audiences. So the first was magnitude and insignificance. Burdinsky works in really large images. Oftentimes, if you see his work in museums and galleries, they are printed at 3 feet by 5 feet. You are looking at enormous photographs. He looks for large industries. He oftentimes looks for the biggest mine, the biggest oil field, the biggest of whatever it is that he's trying to see. He also uses a large format camera. The larger the industry, the more insignificant we feel. For many artists, the extent of the subject matter is not always clear. We see things framed without a horizon, as we saw in the last image, cropped so that the edges of the subject are not known. The extent of the industry is often not known. While it's possible to get statistics for many of these sites, Kant maintains that all estimation of magnitude of the object of nature is in the end aesthetical. Similarly, knowing the Kemicot copper mine, which is now Rio Tinto, is almost 3 miles across and a mile deep, doesn't come close to providing the sense of astonishment felt when one realizes that the tiny dark dotted line on one of the mine's benches is actually a full-size train. And you can see that 5 or 6 benches up. Insignificance in comparison to the size of industry and nature, that's not a bad thing. No one sees like El Cap and says, I wonder how we could take it down, right? It's more problematic when we're talking about these types of toxic landscapes, in which it also has the potential to overwhelm individuals by the magnitude of the problem. Many of these images play with what is known and what is unknown. Contemporary environmental photographers create magnitude through the size of their image and the scale of the subject, but also visually constituting the presence and extent of the contaminants themselves through the use of color or particulates. While the massiveness of the production established through the photograph, the magnitude of the place's toxicity oftentimes remains unknown. Photographers vary in the amount of information they present. This is David Hansen's work. And in all of his work, at least in this era, he presents the images as a triptych. You can see on the left, he provides a topographic map, and on the right, he adds in the application for Superfund money from the federal government. And then you have other photographers like David Maisel, who does not provide any information at all. Ann Wilkes Tucker states in Maisel's catalog for this Terminal Mirage series, she writes, we cannot know without expert explanation which of these colors arises from naturally occurring elements or organic matter, which are deadly toxins created from man-made processes. Nor can we tell which of the natural occurring concentrations would be toxic if ingested. We sense that this violent range of continuous colors is extraordinary and possibly dangerous. Nevertheless, we are drawn by their formal beauty. These pictures are both visually and intellectually engaging, both seductive and disturbing. Humans are absent from the photographs in many of these contemporary landscape artists. People are monstrously present in their absence. The physical evidence of their existence is throughout these images. And this is an interesting contrast to how the sublime was used when talking about nature in things like Carleton Watkins' images. Carleton Watkins, who was, again, he was taking pictures of Yosemite in the 1800s, and he was using those images to try to convince people that we needed to set aside these lands. And he used the sublime in his images to make it appear that people were not in these spaces, to make this appear to be a Garden of Eden, right? But people were there at the time too. People engaged in resource extraction, and Native Americans had migrated seasonally to Yosemite for all time. By excluding them, Watkins was making an argument for a pristine environment that was untouched by humans. That's obviously not what Burdinsky and others are doing here. I argue that the images don't assign blame. There's no easy release of guilt for the viewer, no rhetorical devil or scapegoat, but they don't allow for victims either. When they do include people, as you can see in this image, oftentimes they seem to be present for comparison to the size of the landscape. We're not supposed to engage with them as individual human beings. These images could rightly be criticized for erasing the suffering of those who live, work, and play in these environments, but I offer an alternative argument. I think it requires the viewer to examine their own relationship to the toxin. My relationship is not mediated through another subject, another person in the image. I have to wonder about my own complicity in what I see. And in this case, this is ship-breaking images by Burdinsky, and this is the breaking down of all the ships that are used to move our goods from places like China to the United States and back to China. Another tension that I see in these images is many of the landscape photography I analyze use an elevated perspective, one that allows the viewer to look down on the subject matter, and at the same time, the subject fills the photograph with the project the photographer is trying to capture. A high vertical angle should make us, as the viewer, feel in power and have mastery over what we're seeing as the viewer is positioned with an unrestricted panorama of the landscape. But Burdinsky and others deny a stable ground from which to make that assessment. It might be hard for you to see, but we're actually out on an old train rail and you're looking down thousands of feet through the slats. Safety is not, we gain our safety by not being at that place. We're not smelling the smell, we're not tasting the air or the water, but we are still unsure who the victim of the toxins is. Instead, the photographers give the audience supremacy, but then calls the power into question with the precarious positioning of the camera and the cropping of the shots. The viewer may be powerful, but we are still at risk. And the final tension I talk about is beauty and ugliness in these images. Burdinsky's photographs and other like them have run into controversy. Critics say awful things, dangerous things shouldn't be beautiful. Beauty distracts from the reality of the situation. David Siegel comments about Burdinsky's images that they document shipbreaking, which is the most dangerous work site in the world. And then Siegel deadpans, but dang, it's lovely. Environmental writer Wendell Berry argues, it is unfortunately supposable that some people will account for these photographic images as abstract art or see them as beautiful spaces. But anyone who troubles to identify in these pictures the things that are readily identifiable, trees and buildings and roads and vehicles, will see that nothing in them is abstract and that their common subject is monstrous ugliness. More troubling for Berry is that the beauty of the surface hides what dwells underneath. He says the steady seeping of poison into our world and into our bodies. When I finished this article, I went back to my archives of toxic images and I took a look at all the ones that had been placed in the not sublime pile. They separated into two groups. One was a picture of things like smokestacks, sludge ponds, drain pipes, the ugly without the sublime. And the other were close-up pictures of people who had been visually impacted by contaminants. To analyze both of these sets of images, I used concepts and theories that are used to describe how bodies are used in protest, and especially during things like Carnival. And I also looked at transformed bodies as they're discussed theoretically and how they appear in science fiction. I started with the toxic grotesque, and this is images of visibly altered landscapes that are shown in order to challenge the destructive hegemonies that normalize toxicity and mask its impacts on environment and human health. The first I looked at were images of what I call excretion. Photographs of the toxic, they emphasize individual and municipal porosity. The now iconic images of culverts and tubes and pipes and stacks where contaminated air and waste leave a contaminating entity and enter the surrounding environment. John Fall's 1988 to 90 series Smoke exemplifies these types of images. The photographs are cropped oftentimes to show only the top of the stack, which is centered at the bottom of the frame. The focus is the smoke as it streams upward, swirls, or hangs heavy in the sky. It's constructed as dark and menacing, or white and fluffy, as we can see in this one, red, orange, or yellow with reflections of light. The texture and the color trigger a sense of anxiety or at least disquiet over what appears to be the unnaturalness of the excretion. And to further the concern, the release is moving. It's flowing through the unbounded air. As with Fall's work, other extracted images are frequently cropped to hide the extent of the contamination. The point of excretion, the breached dam, or the open mouth of the pipe is the focus. The destination of the pollutants is unknown. At least the extent of the contamination is not established in the image. Pictures of smokestacks and drain pipes function anecdotally as representations of industrial pollution. We see them all the time as stand-ins for industrial pollution. For these images, it's the permeability that is important. It's the lack of containment. The images reveal we are unwilling or unable as a society to stop contaminants from exceeding their apparently ineffectual boundaries between those that are deemed toxic and those that are intended to be kept clean. Some of the most visually striking toxic grotesque landscape photographs I found are the satellite images of U.S. factory farms or CAFOs. The little dots that you see at the top are cows. These images were discovered by the British photographer Mishka Henner, who was actually looking for military compounds when he saw these. Business Insider notes these lagoons look like giant multicolored petri dishes. Grist describes the images as bloody zombie wounds. Fast Company calls the images a post-apocalyptic nightmare. As examples of the toxic grotesque, the pools appear as openings in the land, revealing the infiltration of toxins in the body of the landscape. The ground is no longer able to contain the infection, allowing the toxins to ooze and pool at the surface. Other grotesque landscape images similarly call to mind sickness or infection. Photographs of toxic algae blooms, commonly referred to red tides, or the algae occurrence at Lake Erie that turn vast expanses of its waterways a thick, swirling, iridescent green. This is the EPA-caused mine breach in the Colorado, and it colored the Animas River a flat orange. Images of hazardous air quality show the air is thick and clotted, obscuring the details of the cityscape and creating an ominous gray uniformity. Unfortunately, Utah oftentimes looks like this too. The images of these toxic events emphasize the strangeness of the incident. What should normally be healthy and clean, the air, the land, the water appear to be sick or abnormal. And as with human infections, the images create the expectation in the viewer that the illness will subside and health will return with the resumption of normal color and density. But of course, this belies the ecological damage that has preceded and is caused by these toxic events. Toxic shock is where I theorized and wrote about people's bodies that have been impacted by toxins. And as always with people in vulnerable populations, there's always the concern that the depictions will be treated as a spectacle, especially when we talk about bodies that in some ways show deformity. They can be exploited, the people can be objectified. As a researcher, I worry that when I talk and show these images, I can reify and amplify the exploitation. And yet, images of altered bodies have always been some of the most powerful visual rhetorical tools used to challenge power structures, and specifically in this case, to provide evidence of the existence of toxins and their physical harm. For toxic shock images, I focus on altered bodies, and this is the important part to me, that are publicly and purposefully revealed in order to challenge the destructive hegemonies that normalize toxicity and mask its impacts on the environment and human health. When these images show up in the news or in magazines or other places online, it's not always easy to know whether the subject, the person participated, knew that they were participating. So that makes this work tricky and important, but difficult. So in this work, I discuss 4 elements of toxic shock imagery, and the first is deformity. This is the famous picture of Tomoko in her bath. This was taken by Eugene Smith in 1971 in Japan. Tomoko's mother agreed to these photographs to show the effects of Minamata disease that was caused by mercury poisoning. In this case, it was from industry releases. Goodwin notes the imagery is strongest in its affect, its feelings in us when it reveals qualities of shared reality than by utter departures from reality. So with the apparent deformities that we see in some of these toxic images, the mundane human elements, and we can see them in this picture, waters, mother, faces, children, bathing, they are all still present, and they often outnumber those elements that make the image striking. Even in the most disturbing photographs of deformity, the viewers search for those basic shared human elements in order to orient themselves to the image. That said, it's the photographer's emphasis on those elements which are anticipated to be different from the viewer's bodies and the viewer's lived experiences that provide the punctum or the emotional punch of the image. Excision images show bodies that are incomplete, lacking in vital parts. They sometimes have pieces cut out of them, limbs are missing, body mutations are dominant traits. That comes from Cicerone. And he says, bodies are constantly reminded that they are not armored containers, but rather invitations to opening and wounding. This is a self-portrait by the artist Matsuka, and she reveals her mastectomy scars in portraits as a way of drawing attention to the connection between environmental toxins and breast cancer. As an activist, and before she became famous through this cover, she put her image of mastectomy scars on postcards and handed them out at protests. In evisceration images, scars are frequently revealed to show harm, whether it's the downwinder scar where a person's thyroid was removed due to radiation exposure, or chest scars from pollution-caused lung surgeries. Through visual representation, excision or dismemberment does not need to be physical. It can be performed through image composition. One of the most common stock photographs used to represent toxins' effects on the body are images of closely cropped hands, as you can see here for arsenic poisoning, or feet. And this is from tannery solvents. Hands and feet are the most publicly accessible and acceptable body parts, and skin ailments are often the most visual of toxic diseases. This type of image actually, I think, functions at cross purposes. One, it protects the privacy of the subject by not showing the individual's face, does not expose intimate or private areas of the body that can raise concerns of exploitation in the viewers. But at the same time, the excised image functions anecdotally again. The diseased part stands in for the presumed diseased whole. The ailment is the sum of the person. Nothing else is shown. Clearly, nothing else matters. Whether the focus is solely on the element that is missing, such as a breast or a particular body part, the hands, repeated representation of an individual or a group through an excision image is a form of objectification. And that, in the best case, can lead to knowledge and action on environmental toxins, and in the worst case, leaves the subject being perceived as less than whole. According to Bakhtin, a body is not separated from the rest of the world. It is not a closed, complete unit. It is unfinished. It outgrows itself. It transgresses its own limits. The stress is laid on those parts of the body that are open to the outside world, that is, the parts through which the world enters the body or emerges from it. In focusing on transgression images, I explore the effects of toxins crossing the placental barrier. And as you know, the result can be incomplete pregnancies and fetal deformities, and they are, of course, the first signs of environmental poisoning. For this chapter, I examined how photographers like Phillips Jones Griffith, are able to represent this most difficult and indecorous subject matter, miscarried and deformed fetuses. For this presentation, for probably pretty obvious reasons, I chose not to show these images. Instead, a stand-in for transgression is oftentimes photographs of animals. They're used to illustrate this transgression of bodies, the world coming in, and the toxic results being forced out. We see this in these images from Chris Jordan, but then you also see them in images when they cut open the stomachs of animals to show all of the things that they've ingested that are not food. Non-human animals are more likely to show visible signs of infiltration and expulsion. Last, one of the most common tropes I found in the visual environmental text emphasized the collapse of the environment and the body. This is Valerie Leonard's Invisible, and as you can read, in 2019, she won the Environmental Photographer of the Year award from the Chartered Institute on Water and the Environment Management. In collapse images, the photographer frames people enveloped in mining dust, coated in tannery solvents, shrouded in black, oily smoke from electronics being burned for their metals. These toxic, grotesque images of collapse are not photographs of the disease or the manifestation itself, but raise the possibility of infection and transgression based on the proximity of the subject to the contaminated site in the images. They remind their viewers that all of us are bodies made out of the environments we live in, and if those environments are polluted, so are we. The problem with these images is that with the repetition of non-Western landscapes and places, and oftentimes poor people of color, the images may allow the false conclusion that toxins are there, but not here. Toxic shock images elicit a yearning in the audience for the reestablishment of boundaries between the normal and the altered, the healthy and the diseased, the clean and contaminated. It creates a demand for strict classifications and non-permeable containers for certainty. Liberation can only come through the reassurance of safety from toxic-caused alterations, which is currently unavailable to any life on Earth. Okay, back to you. The message I would hope CLEAR would take from this presentation is to think very carefully how you visually represent invisible pollutants and the vapor you research for various audiences. The stock images you pull, the individuals who are depicted, the colors, shape, lines, charts you choose all construct meaning about pollutants and your content before you've said or your audiences have read one single word. Thank you all so much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much. At this point, I will just open it up for questions from everybody in the room.
Question.
Yes.
Will there be a recording of this available?
Yes.
I think it is fantastic. Dr. Peeples, thank you so much. And by the way, I heard of Edward Bertinsky the first time on CBC's Ideas program. It's just amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Yes, the recording, as Anna Marie is writing in the chat, this was recorded, and we will share the recording on our social media, and we'll email it out as well. I'll get us started if you don't mind. You know, I was struck by, you know, when you were talking about the toxic and sublime. Of course, I'm thinking about ruin porn, which is all of us here, at least in Detroit, Michigan, are very, very familiar with. And because we have seen so many pictures, especially over the past couple of decades, of these, you know, broken down buildings, and, you know, really talking about Detroit's past in a way that seems beautiful, or the destruction or the decay which seems beautiful, which really, rubs off a lot of people in all sorts of ways. So can you talk a little bit about how you're seeing the toxic sublime in these kinds of urban post-industrial sort of contexts? Is that something that you might be considering?
That's a great question. Maybe I would ask you, can I just toss that question back to you a little bit? Which is, do you think the tensions that I talk about in the toxic sublime, beauty and ugliness, but also magnitude, also feelings of insignificance, you aren't able to do something when you see the extent of the problem. Do you think that actually fits? Is it transferable to what you see in your community?
I think to a certain extent, yeah, because I think that's been part of the resistance to some of these images, right? Because they almost suggest this glorious past which can never be reclaimed sort of a situation,
Yeah.
or this beautiful expanse devoid of people, and people are like, well, no, there are people here. There are so many local communities. And why are we only thinking about one part of the past? So I think a lot of those emotions do come through, which is probably why they resisted quite a lot.
And I think the other thing to think about with photographs is, well, how do they function, right? One is that they work as evidence. Something existed, something was there. They're indexical, that when I took the picture, this is what it looked like at the time. But it also can create a sense of permanence, like that is what that is. It doesn't show what it looked like before. It doesn't show what it looks like after. I think that was kind of the impetus behind even like David Hansen's triptych. Like, the one image isn't enough. It can't be enough. It doesn't give enough information. So he's the one that included the topographic map, and he's the one that also, included the Superfund site explanation. So I think that's one of the problems with images, is because they freeze a very framed and composed image, and it oftentimes, until we think about it critically, it's seen to stand in for the whole, right? It represents all. When we oftentimes forget it's one very brief, old-fashioned camera, the click of a shutter, right? And it's only that, but we use it as evidence. We use it that something existed and that it is, but it doesn't show. Images don't necessarily show potential and change. Yeah. Unless we have a series, and that works too. I see hands up, but can someone else actually?
Sure.
Call on
Alina,
folks?
go ahead, and then I think Wilma had a question in the chat, and we'll head to Graham after that.
Thanks, Jennifer, for the talk. I really loved hearing about all of your fascinating categories. I'm really compelled by the work of Edward Burtynsky, and teach the film Anthropocene, the human epic, sometimes from a critical point of view as well, for that distance and beauty. I was wondering, one other possibility for toxic images, I'm sure there are many other, the image itself as activism, but then images of activism. Activisms when people get active about really gathering together around toxic concerns. And I wonder if you've considered how those function in the landscapes that you're describing. I think I'll stop there because there are lots of other questions.
I haven't, what I looked at in terms of activism was, I was interested in how, and this went back to one of my first projects, where I was interested in looking at representations of the veterans who were fighting for reparations because of being sprayed with Agent Orange when they were in Vietnam. And at that, I actually looked at how were they being presented, because oftentimes bodies that have been changed, challenged, deformed, diseased by toxins are shown very passively. They are the victims that we are supposed to help, right? And it was really interesting, because you saw this kind of, there was a split in how they were presented. Some of the veterans, even though they clearly were experiencing physical difficulties, because you would see something like a cane, when it was talking about the lawsuit itself, they were shown very actively striding down the street. And then very kind of images of passivity, people who were in their beds, oftentimes seen stereotypically as passive, powerless, etc. So I haven't looked specifically at people whose bodies have not been influenced by toxins and how they are constructed, presented in engaging with, as you said, with toxic places. So those who are, and I mean, there's lots of good work out there. Feda Pazula's work on toxic tours is fantastic. And, you know, she talks about people who are in toxic communities bringing in and having literally a tour of their community, so the people are there, they can smell the air, they can see the landscapes for themselves, etc. So, you know, luckily I'm not the only one doing this kind of work. Great question. Thank you.
We have tons of questions. So I'll go with Wilma's asked a question in the chat first. Has abstraction in the visual arts trained us to respond to these images as beautiful?
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time?
Has abstraction in the visual arts trained us to respond to these images as beautiful?
Ah, that is a great question. And I'm going to give a disclaimer and then I'm going to answer the question, which is, in my work, I cross over in talking about chemistry and science and protest and politics and legislation. And I dabble, I've been invited to talk about art and architecture in places, and I feel fraudulent in all of these places because I'm begging, borrowing, and stealing from countless disciplines to do this work. So I am not an art critic, I'm not an art historian, and I will answer your question anyway, which is I think so, right? You know, we have, you know, we had representative work, and then we moved towards impressionist and abstract and all of those kinds of things. So I think that we kind of have this, we can do a paradigm shift, right? So sometimes I look at Maisel's work and I go, I really want that above my couch. Really do. Like, man, that is gorgeous. I love the colors and the lines, you know, and then I read the part at the bottom and realize, you know, that's been taken literally an hour and a half down the road for me. And then I get the gut punch that comes with that. And that's one of the reasons I was fascinated by these toxins, that these images can do both, but we're certainly trained to see something as pretty. And I think especially context matters, right? Where are you seeing this? So Burdinsky's work is up in corporate headquarters. They see this as a sign of the extent of the industry. And then they're also used in protest. And then you also can walk into a gallery and see them hung on the wall. So I think oftentimes the context surrounding the images helps us to know how to respond to it. But we've certainly in some ways been trained to see abstraction as being aesthetic. And we can see them that way. And it's not difficult to do so.
Thank you. I think Graham had another question.
Thank you. And thank you, Jennifer. It was a fantastic presentation. You needn't have been worried. The only fellow classmate from my old school back in Edinburgh, the Royal High School, that I'm in touch with is an artist. And what she does is she repurposes, she basically rips apart old televisions to create jewelry and pieces of art. And I wondered if you'd care to comment on the morality and risk of encouraging people to indulge in such artwork.
That's a really good question. The morality of such work. Well, I mean, on some levels, you could read that as very moral, right? We're reusing these things. I've got a great necklace that was made out of an old Chevy. You know, I think on some levels we could say that that's a very, at least I would know, I don't know about moral, but it's an ethical thing to do. It's part of reduce, reuse, recycle. I think, I mean, do we know where the TVs came from?
Exactly. I worry about the
Right?
personal risk to her for handling these materials. She doesn't know whether there's something poisonous involved in the creation of that piece of equipment. She's an artist. She doesn't know a damn thing about chemicals.
Right, right. And so, I mean, that's the question. You can look at something like shipbreaking, right? I showed you those images, and the ships that we use to transfer goods all over the world, they're too big. You can't dock them somewhere. So what do? We run them aground in places like Bangladesh, and you have people who come out and flip-flops and handheld torches, and they take apart these enormous ships. Someone needs to do this work, or else what are we going to do? We're going to sink them. And then they reuse the metal, and they drain the rest of the fluids, the oils, the gases, whatever's being carried. But it's incredibly toxic and incredibly dangerous, right? And so I think we always have to ask, you talked about an artist, but I think we always have to ask, who's doing the work? Who's doing that labor, and how much of it is a choice? Are they doing it because they want to do this? Your friend who's the artist, I'm going to make some guesses and some assumptions about her socioeconomic standing, and about that she could work with other medium, but she's choosing not to. I think all of those, contextual elements swirling around helps us to make that decision about, is this ethical? Is this moral? Is this a good idea? Just basically, is this a good idea?
If you're interested, I'll send you some images.
I would be. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. I know there are at least 4 other folks with questions, and I have copied Jennifer's email address in the chat. It's jennifer.peoples@usu.edu. So I'm sure she won't mind if you reach out to her by email. Thank you so much for taking the time out to talk with us for what was really a fantastic and wonderful conversation, Dr. Peoples. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for being such a warm and attentive audience. This was a wonderful experience, and you are absolutely welcome to emailing me your questions. I'd be happy to engage with them.
Thank you, everybody. And you can follow us on Twitter, on YouTube, and on LinkedIn. I've shared the links also in the chat. Have a good afternoon. Take care.
Bye, everybody.